Yes, we are very honored to have with us Teesta Setalvad with us. So I'll give a brief intro, not just to Teesta's work, but also to why this session is relevant at this point of time. So as we know that after the Gujarat program of 2002, Teesta Setalvad became very well known for her humanitarian work. With her NGO, the Citizens for Justice and Peace, she and her organization both were co-petitioners in the Jakia Jafri petition to the Supreme Court in context of the Gulbarg Society massacre, which all of you probably know about, in which several people were almost burnt alive by rioting mobs. So they filed a plea in the Supreme Court against the then CM Narendra Modi and others who were in positions of power in the Gujarat state administration and the top police rank officers. So this petition was a criminal complaint for administrative culpability against top politicians and bureaucrats and policemen. So I think it wouldn't be wrong to mention at this point of time that this particular petition itself was a very brave and radical act, because if we look at the history of modern India, one thing for which nobody has ever stood culpable is mass murders, genocide, and pogroms. Be it the 1984 Sikh massacre, be it the 2002 Gujarat pogrom, be it the anti-Dalit massacres at Bathani Tola, or the anti-Christian carnage in Kandhamal. All of these mass massacres and genocides which have happened, which have been photographed, which have been documented, all this evidence, this mounting evidence, people's testimonies, the witnesses' testimonies to the public, nothing has ever, and this is a shame on India and its democracy, that nothing has ever led to culpability of those that were in power. And as we know that if those that were in power do not abet a crime like this, pogroms can never happen. Pogroms are never spontaneous things. So given that this is the history of holding people accountable in India, this petition was an act of great bravery, and the people involved in this petition were taking personal risks to just, this is the least that they could do at that point of time. So Teesta Setalvad is also known for her other work. She has been a senior journalist, and she has also been a human rights defender who has used campaigns, strategic legal interventions to defend the rights of those who were oppressed in multiple ways and those who were wronged. So apart from her work in Gujarat, she has also been working with Citizens for Justice and Peace in Assam in recent times, where people were being left out of the NRC list, and they were fighting cases in the foreigners' tribunals, which was also a case for Tariq pe Tariq, like people, very vulnerable, very poor people, being made to travel thousands of kilometers just to appear at the tribunals where everything was stacked up against them. So it was like individuals, like we saw in the film Noor Islam. It was like very marginalized individuals standing up to the might of the Indian state who were trying to dispossess them of their citizenship. In this context also, Teesta's work has been spectacular. She and also a multiple of other lawyers and human rights defenders have worked in Assam, and they're still working in Assam to sort of to legally assist all of these people who stand at the risk of losing their citizenship. Talking about a more recent context, talking about what happened in June 2022, you know what happened in June 2022 is that the Supreme Court of India gave a clean chit to Mr. Narendra Modi, who is now the Prime Minister. He was then Chief Minister of Gujarat, in the Jakia Jafri petition case. And as they say, as the Home Minister of India very chillingly pointed out to us, that we have to understand the chronology. He had said, "Ab chronology samjhiye." So let us look back at the chronology of June 2022. So a day after the Supreme Court gave clean chit to Narendra Modi in that Jakia Jafri case, a day after that, in the morning, Mr. Amit Shah appears in an ANI interview, and he says that I have read very carefully the judgment, and the judgment also was very chilling in the sense that it said that people who have been for multiple times and for long years, those who have been petitioning in the court, that's kind of their fault. So they are in a larger conspiracy to malign so-called innocent individuals, and so the court said that in a chilling verdict, and Mr. Amit Shah next day comes up, gives an interview on ANI, and the very day the Gujarat Anti-Terrorism Squad barges into Teesta's home without a warrant and arrests her. So she is now fighting that case. And she has said that she will not be in a position to speak particularly about that case and also about the Gujarat massacre, that the sort of the trail after that, because she has been legally advised, or she thinks it's legally not a right moment to talk about that in public. But she will be talking about all the other things. So when you ask questions, please also keep that in mind, that she is right now fighting a case. So it's a very serious matter, and whatever she says may be blown out of proportion or may be misconstrued. So we have to be very careful. So with that, it's my honor to invite Teesta Setalvad on stage to come and deliver the festival keynote address. Thank you, Teesta, for being here. Thank you.
Hello, friends. Thank you, Kasturi, for that very warm introduction, and thank you for the People's Film Collective. Always a very great honor and a lot of energy and solidarity when I've come here. I've come here before, and I would like to begin by congratulating the People's Film Collective that has been undertaking this effort for the last decade to bring films of the kind that we are seeing yesterday and today and tomorrow, and in that sense to try and rejuvenate a people's culture, a film watching culture among all of us. I thought, in spite and despite the 2002 huge blip on our democratic landscape, the issue of idea of justice, there are enough other things to speak about, and I will speak about some of those. And I'd like to flag some of these issues before you. That the question I would like to raise here is that in 21st century India, today in 2023, especially since 2014, but the expanse can go further, we see policy and laws being implemented to stifle the voices and rights of all our different sections of the people. This then, both policy and laws, enacted laws with sanction of the legislature, empowers the executive to undertake a whole set of actions which inherently sort of mitigate against the values that are enshrined and the sovereignty that is given in the preamble to our Constitution. So the question I think we need to ask today, or rather one of the several questions that we need to ask is, what are those policies? What are those laws? And do we have a democracy that works at a deepened level, or do we only have a democracy that is being managed through an electoral process that has been fine-tuned into an election machine, while also ensuring that institutions like the Election Commission, the financing of elections, media, etc., is efficiently managed? So what sort of form of democracy are we seeing at work when we are indeed seeing elections? Spectacular spectacles, a lot of money being spent at these elections, a non-transparent financial instrument driving the election in the form of electoral bonds with their anonymity, yet to be judicially examined by the Supreme Court. The matter has been pending for some years now. So what does this actually mean in terms of a functioning, real democracy? Within this gambit, we've had a series of laws being enacted or amended in Parliament, leading to a kind of a interjection by one of our leaders of the left, saying that it is Parliament itself, we're in a unique situation, a tragically unique situation today, where Parliament itself is being used to demolish the Constitution brick by brick. So what do we mean by that? Substantive law, procedural law. Both of these are being given a go-by, And I think we need to just deconstruct that and somehow also ensure that they become part of our political and social campaigns. Baba Sahib Ambedkar's, historic, prescient, and echoing words are something that we are recalling more and more today. That can you really have a political, viable democracy at work when a social, viable democracy is not at work among our people within society, and economic and social inequality is rampant? That becomes even more stark today. We have a situation where 0.25 of GDP per person is spent on access to legal aid, making the whole question of access to courts, access to legal aid, the ability to approach the courts in defense of individual rights and collective rights, a foregone and far-off dream for most of our people. In this overall scenario, we are being dubbed an electoral autocracy, a half democracy, increasingly autocratic forms of governance are emerging, and we are seeing, in fact, more and more power being vested with the police to criminalize protest, to criminalize acts of dissent, and the result we've seen, the most brutal, I think, example of this is what happened to the young, dynamic leadership that inspired the anti-CAA, NPR, NRC movement post-December 2019 and right up to early 2020 in the capital of Delhi, begun by women from the minority community leading a defense of their young community members from the Jamia who were brutally lathi-charged by the police on 15th December 2019 when they were protesting this law, this amendment to the citizenship law. And we saw spiraling protests across the country inspired by the Shaheen Bagh movement and the protests. And we saw from the East India to North India to Western India echoes of the anti-CA, anti-NPR protest. In 3 or 4 months, the kind of vibrant protests that the streets of India saw took the constitution to the streets, took the constitution to the people with an understanding among one section of the marginalized India's minority that they have a stake and that they're asserting their stake in not just citizenship but in the future. And we saw thereafter the pandemic and the lockdown that was imposed in a way completely democratically. We saw the undemocratically, we saw the manner in which that lockdown impacted on 63 crores of our Pravasi Kamgar, our migrant worker, and of course on the protests that had begun from Delhi. And we still have, as of today when I speak, 18 of our leadership, men and women, all young, all at the leadership of the anti-CA and anti-NPR movement, all Muslim, charged under UAPA and in Tihar jail. So this is the scenario in which we are speaking. Yet, in the midst of the pandemic imposed lockdown, where it seemed that the streets and public spaces were being governed by the police and by the government, you had the most vibrant farmers' protest overtake all our imaginations, and a sense of hope that even with the most autocratic of governments, it is possible to organize, it is possible to resist. And I think it is with that hope that we need to take our analysis and struggles further. So apart from the CA 2019, and I think enough has been said about it, but it's worth recalling, that the first time in the history of this country, a religious marker is brought into our citizenship law, something that defies the very foundational basic structure of our constitution that says that we believe in composite citizenship, equality for all, where you can't discriminate between one citizen or another on the basis of caste, gender, community or class. And I think CA 2019, therefore, is a really, really brutal departure from that. In addition, you had the abrogation of Article 370, Jammu. We've had the anonymity around the electoral bonds and government funding. We've had the entire right to education versus the cultural rights, that is the hijab controversy. And we've had brutal property seizure notices and criminalizing of protests in the states like Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat, and Madhya Pradesh, where anti-CA protesters were in fact, there's a chilling report from Uttar Pradesh, which tells us that thousands of FIRs were registered against over 1 lakh of people at the time in 2019. And 23 people were actually martyrs, were killed because of the brutality of the police during peaceful protests. And you saw many, many people being put in jail. We also see an area that we look less at. We also see the fact that Forest Rights 2006, and that is why I want to take a step back from 2014 and also put before this August audience that before 2014, what sort of a democracy were we? If we talk about regression backwards after that date, were we a kind of a completely developed, seasoned, responsive, we the people democracy, or were we a democracy in the making? And I think for me, a very, very personal as well, a very important example has been the enactment of the Forest Rights Act, the Rights of Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes and Forest Dwellers Act of 2006, which was a legislation enacted. Rules were brought in 2012, and it's basically a recognition of rights law. It's a rights law that has actually recognized the agitations and the protests and the struggles of the small agrarian classes and Adivasis that have continued since colonial times, articulating their need to control the rights over the forests that they have nurtured and the lands, revenue lands, which are not necessarily forest lands, that they've nurtured over generations. Now, the FRA Act was enacted 56 years after the Schedule 5 and 6 and 9 of the Constitution in 1950, which theoretically the schedule gave the autonomy of Adivasis and tribes, autonomy over their lands. But no effective law made that autonomy possible till 2006, which is why for many of the vast of the 123 crore Adivasi population of this country with whom my association now goes back 10 years, close association, for them it is this law that has a guarantor of some degree of protection and freedom in the future. So, to give an example, whether it is this law, the Right to Information Act, or Manrega, or what we want is a social security for the urban poor, all these display that even laws to become truly emancipatory and recognize the structural deficiencies in our society and to measure to the promise made in the Constitution takes time, and that the Indian legislature post-independence had not completely responded to the demands even before, up to 2014. Of course, between 1973 and 1975, we had a brutal assault, the first assault on democracy when emergency was declared, and the judiciary was sought to be turned into a committed judiciary. So there was a blip even there, and therefore, our efforts since 1947 and 1950 has been collectively to assure that we get there, that we become a democracy which is responsive, which is representative, which is deep enough, which is culturally diverse and plural, and the institutions of governance that ensure that this democracy is in operation also display representation, diversity, and plurality. It was a vision and an experiment in the making, till we received this rude shock in 2014, and we see an actual interruption of that process and a regression to that process. And the reason why I say that is because of the first time you see in power at the center in several Indian states, an ideology at work and their elected officials who represent that ideology, whose the very ideology of which militates against the Constitution. And in fact, the ideology that says that they believe in overturning the Constitution. Whether they can do it, have done it, to what extent they are successful, is a matter of present and future history to evaluate and decide. But that ideology is therefore at war with the basic structure and the Constitution that the edifices of our democracy are supposed to be sitting on. And therefore, the very idea of justice today in 21st century India is governed by this duality and dichotomy. And that is what we are all facing as individuals, as conscientious dissenters, as citizens who believe that it is the vision of the Constitution that needs to be taken forward and not a sectarian, religion-based nationhood. This is the conflict and the dialectic that we are facing. And hence, it's not difficult to understand why the protagonists of this ideology, be they sitting in the union government in Delhi or in the various governments, be it in Lucknow, Gandhinagar, Bhopal, wherever they are sitting in the states, need to bring in laws that actually criminalize protest. And what do I mean for that? You bring in a law that says that anybody who breaks Section 144 issued by the police is liable to criminal action without any reasons given. That has been passed in UP, that has been passed in Madhya Pradesh, that has been passed in Gujarat. So at every form, we are seeing a reversion back to laws that go back to the colonial period. I keep saying I've done this study on the UAPA, which is a dreaded law, and I like to ask this question in Kerala as much as in Bengal and Telangana and Tamil Nadu, which are hopes for us because they are opposition states, that we hope that these state governments are not using UAPA. Because UAPA is a law that was brought in by the union government in 2004. And it was brought in after POTA was repealed. And ironically, before that you had TADA for 10 years, you had POTA since 2003, ordinance, and then becomes a law. And there was a promise during the general elections by the opposition parties that we will repeal POTA. POTA was certainly repealed in 2004, but to counter the pressures of repealing POTA, a 1960s law, UAPA, that already existed, Unlawful Practices Act, was amended to make it a permanent counter-terrorism law permanently in our criminal statute books. At that time, I recall few of us saying that it's a dangerous step that even UPA1 was undertaking. Only the two left parties, CPI and CPM, spoke against it in Parliament. The two largest parties agreed and passed the laws. And then you had amendments to UAPA in 2009, in 2014, and the worst one came in 2017-18. What do these laws like UAPA, PMLA, and others do? They not just reverse the burden of proof, but they make conditions for bail very stringent, and we need to go back to the history of these laws. 1909, 1910, 1919 India, under British rule, the Rowlatt Acts are passed. Very similar, Criminal Law Amendment Act is passed by the British. Very similar proceedings, very similar sections. Protests all over the country, very, very organized protests, and which lead to then the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, as we have noted in our history. So why should a democratically elected government, a powerful government, a strong government, which sees itself as a majoritarian government, need a law like UAPA? Why does it need to criminalize protests? Why does it need to use the police as a strong arm of the government, all of which are kind of not just anti-democratic practices, but affect the idea and delivery of justice? That's the question we need to ask, and the answer is obvious, that if inherently your rule is threatened by the fact that you are afraid of the constitutional values of equality and non-discrimination, and you want to create a situation within which, in theory and in practice, you actually implement discriminatory laws, then you need the strong arm of the police to ensure a criminalizing of voices and of protest voices and dissent. Coming back to FRA 2006, very interesting, because potentially a constituency of the ruling party that they cannot easily antagonize. 2006, the FRA Act is passed, but since 2014, National Education Policy 2020, the Forest Conservation Rules, the Mining Act, the Highway Act, all these laws are passed to dilute completely the implementation of the Forest Rights Act of 2006. And in February 2019, a shocking thing happens in the Supreme Court, where actually the Supreme Court orders the eviction of all our Adivasis who are living on these lands, when under the FRA Act, eviction is not a permissible act, because you're actually in the process of recognizing rights of all our Adivasis and forest dwellers. There are nationwide protests, and then the Supreme Court itself is compelled to stay its own order. So these are the kind of developments and challenges we are facing from democratic institutions. Elected governments, executive, legislature, and sometimes even the judiciary. And therefore, we have to see how the idea of justice is actually being seriously affected by these extremely anti-constitutional acts, which are taking us several decades backwards. Without making a very crass comparison, and before I go exactly to the kind of progression of laws as they emerge in Nazi Germany, just to give an idea and suggest maybe that there's a pattern somewhere, I'd like to point out 2 or 3 more things that have happened in the last 2.5 years. One is eviction notices on large shanties, urban shanties, claimingly to be on quote-unquote government land. Now, whose land is it? What land is it? People have been living there for 40 years, 50 years, have been paying their taxes, have got papers, have got documents to prove that their residentship in that area. Yet from Uttarakhand to Delhi to Uttar Pradesh to Madhya Pradesh to Gujarat, they are being served these eviction notices, which again mitigate against the policies, housing policies of the governments in power and the central government in Delhi. Apart from eviction notices, you have a government in Uttar Pradesh coming to power proudly claiming that we are going to use a bulldozer. Now, this bulldozer Baba and its government, what it did in Allahabad, what was done in the capital of Delhi in Jahangirpuri, all of these developments show a very crude arm of the state at work. And this state is claiming legitimacy from being elected by a brute majority. And this is the challenge that we face. That elections happen, elections take place. The ruling party has commanded the election process into the minuteness and efficiency of a machine, guaranteed results because of financial non-transparency, because of electoral bonds, and institutional protection because of lack of independence of institutions like the Election Commission and their functioning. And therefore, it's working. It's working very efficiently for the party in power. And where will the challenge come for this entire model is the question we need to raise. We've also seen over the last 2 years a complete dilution of the Places of Worship Act, a law that was passed by Indian Parliament post the demolition of the Babri Masjid on 6 December 1992, an act that is over 30 years old now, and which changed the very character of Indian politics and the Indian state. And this act was brought in by Parliament in its wisdom at the time. If you look at the debates, even people like Ramvilas Paswan, who's now on the other side, saying that we need such a law. We need such a law because we are a modern nation, we are a syncretic nation, we are a democratic nation, and therefore there should not be any attempts to claim rights over religious and cultural places. And yet we've seen in the last 2 years alone over 35 such attacks on mosques, madrasas, dargahs, etc., taking place across the length and breadth of the country in complete violation of this law. So, rule of law is a term we often use when we try and describe what the Constitution has mandated. The rule of law means the respect for procedure, a certain certainty, a certain accountability by the state towards its people, which means that we will assure you that there will be equality, right to life with dignity, equality before the law, and non-discrimination. But what we are seeing is a complete absence and dilution of that. And therefore, what sort of reality are we living under? It's not completely disappeared yet, but there's a severe erosion of it. And just quickly to flag the kind of laws that were passed in Nazi Germany, I mean, we saw the state being transformed into a state that sort of justified biological racism. Then you had the declaration of emergency, where the leader principle was established that he is above the law, the Führer is above the law. Then a sort of inequality was established within the judiciary because only racially appointed judges were given legitimacy. Ethnic cleansing was justified by saying that removal of non-Aryans and politically unreliable sections from citizenship. Then civil service legislation was brought in. And this was interesting because ancestral legislation that defined who is and who is not German. Then there was the Night of Long Knives, where 80 people were massacred overnight, political dissenters, political this thing, night of the broken glass, synagogues, Jews, other ethnic communities, severely brutalized, law without any, the Reichstag. So you pass a law without going through parliament. It's a unique form that was used in Germany. We are seeing in contrast, parliament being used to completely bypass procedure. So the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019 is passed in 9 or 10 or 11 hours after strong opposition by the opposing parties, but it's passed by midnight and it's gazetted by 12th of December morning. So you give a complete go-by to parliamentary procedure. You do not send laws of such significance to parliamentary standing committees. You don't invite comments by the public and the opposition. You don't allow debate over the laws that you're going to pass. And yet you say, we are the world's largest democracy. And we get our strength from the people who have voted for us. And this is the dichotomy that we face. The holy book of the ideology in power, one of the holy books, Bunch of Thoughts, I'm not talking about We Are Our Nationhood Design, actually says that we should believe in the overthrow of the constitution and the bringing back of a Manusmriti, where there's a cleaned up caste hierarchy in function. So it's a very strange dichotomy between the kind of Aryan, non-Aryan concept that you had in Nazi Germany, and here, a kind of resting easy on the historical Brahmanical exclusion caused by a caste structure. And episodically, I'd like to share with you something that we saw in February 2016 and 17 at the Delhi Book Fair, when the collected works of Baba Saheb Ambedkar were being sold. We have the original volumes published by the Maharashtra government, nice Sarkari solid volumes which have all his works. These then, Maharashtra government then enters into every year a written contract with the Social Welfare Ministry of the Center, Union government, and they published a prettied up version, a more elegant version of Baba Saheb's work, and they've been doing so for years. But since 2016, the collected works of Ambedkar selling in the Delhi Book Fair, published by the Union government, are -3 critical volumes. And those are Annihilation of Caste, State and Minorities, and the Communal Award. And it's very, very clear the kind of Baba Saheb Ambedkar that they would like generations to remember is not the Baba Saheb Ambedkar who brutally and very incisively deconstructed caste, and who also spoke about how the issue of minority versus majority should be looked at in democratic India. It's very a curious thing for me that even eminent intellectuals who talk about the conflict between the Congress and the Muslim League pre-partition, which led to the rejection of the communal award as put by the Muslim League, do not even look at the extremely innovative way in which Baba Saheb Ambedkar looked at how electorates should be structured and designed. I dare say, if Baba Saheb Ambedkar's suggestions had been more central to the debate pre and post-independence, it would have been make for a far more diverse understanding than the Hindu-Muslim binary that is generally taken by all of us. Then, of course, in Nazi Germany, you had the flag laws, the Nuremberg laws, and then finally the citizenship law, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, and laws that more and more were narrow and actually legitimized the ethnic cleansing and the dreaded concentration camps that were huge mechanisms for mass murder and torture. Hannah Arendt's work, which I'm sure many are familiar with, when she talks about the whole concept of the concentration camp, is something I looked at very closely when my organization, Citizens for Justice and Peace, started working in Assam. And I'm deliberately going to be winding up my lecture referring to this because whereas the dread and the threat of the implementation of CA 2019, National Population Register and National Register of Citizens at an all India level is dreaded by all of us right-thinking Indians at an all India level. The state of Assam, very close to us here, has been reeling under this specter of statelessness for the last, since 2008 and 9, and even before that. There's a long history to the conflict in Assam, to the ethnic issues in Assam, to the Assam movement and the violence within the movement, to how it targeted 63 dissenting left intellectuals in the late 70s and 80s. All of that will take too long to go through here. But in short, I'd like to say that a three-pronged trident, the National Register of Citizens Assam, the de-voter declaration by the Election Commission, and the declared foreigners dreaded notice, which is issued by the Assam Border Police and validated again by a pre-independence colonial law called the 1946 Foreigners Act, is what is making the lives of many Assamese people, which includes the Santalis, the Namoshudras, the Bengalis, the Gorkhas, actually not just miserable, but looming under the fear of statelessness. Assam has roughly a population of 3 crore people, and 1.3 crores in the first instance were rendered out of the NRC list. Then the number came down to 44 lakhs, and now the number has come down to 19 lakhs. Even in the final 19 lakhs, 1,19,000, it's not, though the political target was certainly the Bengali-speaking Muslim, it has gone far beyond that. It has affected Gorkhas, it has affected the Bengali-speaking Hindus the most, and all sections of ethnicities and minorities. And this is why, when the anti-CAA 2019 movement began all over the country, my organization, Citizens for Justice and Peace, and please go to our website, cjp.org.in, did about 300 trainings across the length and breadth of the country trying to explain to people that please do not think that, well, the chronology put forward by India's Home Minister was that to placate sections of the Hindu minority stroke majority, that we will accommodate you under CAA. The application of the NRC process and the citizenship process in Assam has ensured that once you empower a bureaucracy and the lower bureaucracy and the Election Commission with determining documentary proof of citizenship, it's a recipe for disaster. I'd like to begin by saying that nowhere in the world do you have a documentary test for citizenship. Indian citizenship law is very clear. We have citizenship by birth, by descent, and then we also by naturalization. We have made the issue of citizenship a little bit more stringent post-2004 by saying that, if one of the parents of a citizen is an illegal migrant, then citizenship can come into question. But the process of declaring an individual illegal migrant is a rigorous one. And what is happening in Assam is, on the basis of 2 or 3 or 4 official documents where there's misspelling of names, different dates are written on different certificates, you have people being declared non-Indians without due scrutiny. Now, totally our calculation tells us that if you look at all these 3 categories, NRC excluded, the de-voter and the declared foreigner, 22 lakh people are affected along with their families in the state of Assam. If we try and fight that case on a case-to-case basis, our organization is trying to do that, as some others, it will take 234 years. 234 years. So while we are doing it right now, eventually the solution has to come from the people, it has to be a judicial solution, and it has to be a political solution. And therefore, I think all these issues that I've tried to raise here, whether it is implementation of the Forest Rights Act 2006, recognition of land rights for Adivasis and forest dwellers, whether it is the question of decriminalizing of protest laws, repealment of UAPA, repealment of laws that criminalize, authorize the state to take over property because of protests, and all these various sections, including PMLA, these need to be subject matter of citizens' campaigns. Or else, as we are facing just now, not just a crisis of Indian democracy, but we are facing the very idea of justice and the idea of implementation of justice getting skewed. While I was in Sabarmati jail for over 63 days, it's a lonely place, it's a dehumanizing place. I've been appealing to friends across the country wherever I speak since my release that in the 70s and 80s we used to have political programs of conducting jail visits to whichever district jail in our vicinity whichever jail is there, and I would urge all of you to please begin those. What gave me strength was the fact that politically conscious groups and individuals with whom I associated began letter writing campaigns to me, and I started getting one after the other, letters after letters inside the jail. Now, therefore, the writing of letters to political prisoners and dissenters is a political act, it's a social act, it's an empowering act, and it's an act that gives you immense strength and reduces your sense of isolation. So I think a lot of these very humane things, creative things, become then modes of protest and struggle. I'm often asked the question that how do you protest at times like this, when the state clamps down, when this happens and that happens. So I don't think you or we are apostles of deciding how we do it. I think the very act of conducting such a film festival at a time like this is an act of dissent, is a cultural act of protest. I think writing letters to political prisoners in jail, individually and collectively, are such acts. Organizing meetings, doing protests, trying to rejuvenate our people's culture, all of this are ways of struggle and protest. More than anything else, I think, we need to be able to pay more than a little attention to the kind of ideas of justice that are being not just thrown down from the top, but are being accepted by sections of society. We need to assert that the idea of justice cannot be that hundreds and thousands of people of ours are compelled to walk home because the government has not thought of their transportation in an ill-declared lockdown. That cannot be our idea of justice. Our idea of justice cannot be that unemployment and joblessness is not the demand of the day, that social welfare is not the demand of the day, a life of dignity is not a demand of the day. Somehow we need to bring back the public discourse of access away from hate speech and vitriol, which seems to work during elections. How do we ensure that the vitriol and poison of hate speech does not work during election time? We can only try and do that by ensuring that we are with the people so that that poison that is generated by that idiom has been already countered within the conversations we've had and the discourse that is developed. I still recall on 6th of December 1992, I don't know how many younger people in this room even know of it, but many of my generation would remember that for the first 1 week after the demolition, there was a sense of horror even among some of the right-wing supporters of the act. But the moment in neighboring Bangladesh and Pakistan, attacks began on temples and the minority populations there, the mood drastically shifted and changed. So these are the kind of very volatile dynamics we are dealing with internally and externally. They make a challenge for us on how do we ensure a rational, to-the-cause discourse, ensure our own sanity and depth, ensure building of allyship between different struggles, different modes of development struggles, Adivasi struggle, labor struggles, Uber, Ola, driver struggles, Swiggy, Zomato, workers' struggles. How do we conceptually develop an allyship with all of these while ensuring that within these struggles too, hate and division is not being sown and a sense of majority-minority exclusion has not taken root? I mean, these are, for me, the biggest challenges to further an idea of constitutional justice and real justice in this country. It's a difficult choice. It's a choice that requires courage even, resilience even, out-of-the-box thinking even. But I just like to end by saying that I think if we put our heads to it, the tide simply has to turn. We do not have a viable way of carrying on in this unsustainable way. Thank you very, very much.
since you mentioned political prisoners as one of the main aspects of your speech, I think a new class of political prisoners is now emerging, which is civil society people. And very uniquely, like if we look at recent years, they have been touching people who they think are not part of political party as such, but they're organizing as citizens. Like if we look at all the political prisoners in jail now, apart from those that have been in jail for a longer time, the recent people who are being picked up are from the civil society as we know it. So, and you are part of that. So your time in prison, I think we can talk about that and what that told you about this. Have you been meeting other political prisoners, and you've also been close friends with some of them. So how do you see it from inside the prisons?
Actually, I'd just like to start off by saying that it's a very important question, but we don't really have a concept of political prisoners in our country. So when you're inside, there's not as if there's one place where all of you are kept, unfortunately. So you could be in different places. So the people you're meeting, the women I was with in the barrack number 6 was actually ordinary women, who are mothers, sisters, who are there for other crimes, like crimes under IPC. They're not political prisoners in that sense. But yes, one of the demands we need to read, because except West Bengal, which has a 1960s act, which somehow has a definition to political prisoner, the concept in our country is not even recognized in law as to a political prisoner being different from any other. And it'll be a huge battle getting the state and the police to accept it. So as of now, yes, it's on occasion in Tihar jail or whatever, you'll have 2 or 3 people together. But otherwise, as of now, you don't have such a concept operating within jails. Which you had pre-independence and all of that, that at least one class, not even then in Bengal and others, you had a whole section of left activist prisoners who were not treated well. But certainly upper class, the more visible ones were,
Right. So, as you say, like recourse to justice has become a very difficult choice for people who are not well known, right? And you gave a percentage of like how much people are spending just to get justice itself. So, your work in the NRC area around legal aid in that area, like how do you see it? Is it changing, or is it because the ruling party somehow has of late, after they got the drubbing in West Bengal, they've gone a little silent on that. But if you go to Assam, like we have been there recently, there are murmurs of it coming up again before the elections. So from the point of view of people seeking justice for their citizenship, how do you see the ground situation in Assam right now, since you've been working there?
No, the situation in Assam remains grave, very, very grave. And I mean, CJP is backing, has created this amazing team there, which is local Assamese, Bengali, it's a very diverse team of women, men who are doing this work in 19 districts. And our experience is that because of this very intense engagement of ours and a couple of other groups, but we are probably the widest, the rulings in the foreigner tribunal sometimes are coming out as positive, because the procedure being followed earlier was not being followed. But it's very onerous. Like I said, it's case to case to case. And even in High Court, we are getting some positive rulings. In fact, so apart from actual legal aid, what we've done through CJP is we've had 3 workshops, which are state level in Assam, where we try and call lawyers, whoever's working, not just lawyers who are all, quote unquote, with CJP, but with any group or any individual, so that whatever expertise we have gained, we share with them, and we give them judgments and precedents and all that in the sharing of public information. And that has really widened the network further. So there's a greater consciousness on how to legally deal with this issue. But having said that, like I said, the numbers are way beyond the scope of even a vast group. So eventually we will need a mass movement which demands a political solution, because it cannot go on. It's not viable. But as of now, the work is generating this sort of change perception in the way FTs are dealing with it, and even the Guwahati High Court is looking at the issue, because you're getting better documented resistance from individuals who are the way they're able to put their arguments forward and all of that. But like I said, that's a case-to-case basis. Your first part of your question was, even on the census, there was an article, in fact, the other day in Scroll, which said that For the first time in the history of India since British India, India has not held its census since 2011, which is unheard of. You have to have a decadal census. And the reason is because they tried just before the pandemic to include 4 questions which were NRC driven.
NPR, right.
NPR driven, asking for birth, descent, legacy and all. And there was a huge protest. So they're stuck there. So therefore they don't know how to go forward. That on the one. Then there is a demand for a caste census. So there are 2-3 contra demands that are holding this government back. On the NRC also, because of the proximity of Bengal to Assam and the fact that, large section of the affected in Assam are the Namoshudras, who are the big vote in Bengal, they're literally wary about how far to go. But I don't think we should be complacent. You never know how they will try to manipulate the situation.
Since we don't have a lot of time, my last question would be on the media, the changing media. We, of course, know about it. But particularly coming to your case and also remembering what happened with Umar Khalid and what happened with Sudha Bhardwaj, I found this a very chilling thing that even before Sudha was arrested or you were arrested or Umar was picked up, the most powerful media channels were used to actually create a consensus for you or Umar or Sudha being on the wrong side or, declaring all of you to be guilty. And this is perhaps, media has been going from bad to worse, we all know that. But this kind of a vendetta-driven media, since you've been a journalist yourself, you run media, alternative media channels, how do you see this particular very vindictive turn of the media where individuals may find themselves, turning on the TV one fine evening that, their names are being spelled out as potential terrorists or potential anti-nationals or people to look out for, people to hate, and then following that consensus, using the media, those people are arrested and then, this hegemony is created and people don't protest, so.
Your examples are very stark, but I would, because of lack of time, I didn't deal with this, but otherwise I always speak about that whenever history is written about this very dark period in our political existence, I think the abdication of the Indian media will have a very special few chapters, because apart from the undermining of other institutions, I think the complete abdication by the Indian media of critical questioning of policy and law and the government's functioning has enabled the government to function in just the way and the examples that you've given. So, of course, there'll be specific people and enemies who you mentioned. I think it's way beyond individuals. I think they've just, what we are seeing today is a corporatization complete ideological submission of the media. So you have a media takeover by big corporates. On the one hand, you have parliamentarians who are crorpatis and billionaires in parliament and assemblies. Those billionaires are also mining company owners, telecom company owners, and television channel owners. So you can see how there's a stranglehold on our democracy, and therefore you will not have a proper debate on, what is the issue behind the arrest of Umar or Teesta or Sudha. They will be going to an agenda. The entire campaign will be through an agenda, and I just consider myself at least fortunate that there are other sections of the media who was very valiantly giving a counter narrative. And I don't think every activist is so lucky or every journalist is so lucky, and I wish it would happen for everybody, because I think that goes a long way in trying to counter the balance. Of course, you can't counter the influence of Times Now and Republic easily, and we've called those channels out, and I'm deliberately naming them, because I think it's a shame on journalism what they are doing. But there are others as well, and I think the time for singling them out and excluding them from people's presence has come. That you discredit them, saying that they are not real journalism, they are not real media. And this is a debate that we've been having for a long time among journalist and activist circles, that some people do not dignify. Some platforms do not dignify a democratic presence because they're just conducting a khap panchayat. So I think the abdication of large sections of the commercial media, particularly electronic, is something that has also become a strong arm of this regime.
Right. Yeah. And
what we are seeing, is a shift of the Indian state to not just the socio-religious political right, but also to the far economic right, because seeing the transfer of public resources to private capital. And there's no questioning of that as well. Are we looking at Indian railways ko kya ho raha hai? Look at the pricing, look at the cost of Tatkal tickets. Is it really being okay for people to, so many issues we are not discussing, Because once the media were to start discussing those, the narrative would shift from what the ideological underpinning of this state is.
Yeah, and let us also mention at this point of time those journalists who have stood out.
And also lost their lives.
Exactly. So I think the count of journalists in jail from remote areas, not only well-known journalists, but also people who are stringers, who are...
We lost about 400 plus journalists during the pandemic because they were trying to do heroic job of good coverage, on-the-spot coverage, that has not been recognized by society at large. So there are many, many issues that we need to flag. And I always make a big distinction between the ownership media and the individual protagonist who's always trying. Because I've been a journalist, I think an individual journalist always tries to do her or his job. But in today's circumstances, it's extremely difficult.
Okay, so we will have time for 2 very, very short questions, but unfortunately we can't take more than that. So anyone who wants to go.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, when I was a student, I was very politically active. And when I was a student, I was very politically active. I was discussing all these things. We used to have a lot of debates. But when I came into the workforce, all the energies, all the mental energies went on the struggle for survival. So how would you suggest that the youth of India who are working today to be politically active?
I am from Delhi. I have seen when the CA and that farmers CA was going on, how much the hardship the local people have gone through. And the incidents of stone pelting and other things, they were also subjecting those things. So how do you support the hardship of the local people? Even I also went through, past Seinbag, around 10 kilometers or 15 kilometers and like that. So it was a terrible suffering for the local people. So you don't, how can you support that? They could have done it somewhere away from the main road or some other places.
I'll take that first question about, it's not a question of why do I support those people. Sir, it's not a question of whether you or I support one section of protesters or not. The question is that in a democracy, do we have the democratic right to protest, and what should be the response of a government or a state? That's the question here. The question is, should a protest be criminalized and brutalized? We are not talking about which space in a particular instant is legitimate or not legitimate. I did not speak about the space of Shinebag on that road or whatever it is. Point is, people are protesting for a reason. We have huge political rallies in our cities. We have rallies where tissues are distributed, tridents are distributed, where large ijtemas happen for Muslim religious gatherings. All those are allowed, and that's not a problem. So I don't see why political protest of a certain kind, if you don't have spaces for political protest, in Delhi at the moment, Jantar Mantar is not allowed. It's become a very small space. Earlier, Ramlila Maidan was allowed for protest. So I think we need to ask also, where are the spaces for protest in our cities anymore? Once we have spaces, then I think your question is fully legitimate, that why is the road being blocked? But आपके पास अगर जगह ही नहीं है to have a visible protest, where people like you and me can both see the protesters, then it's like saying that protests आप बाहर करो, दिल्ली border के बाहर, कलकत्ता border के बाहर, media आएगी तो आएगी, नहीं तो नहीं, otherwise don't disturb my traffic. I mean, that's not our notion of a democracy, surely. So it's not a question of my supporting that particular protest at that locality. It's an idea we are talking about. The first question is very legitimate about young people, and I always tell younger people who ask me this question that, we had an easier time when we were your age because it was an easier time, less pressure, less competitive, and less dire in terms of jobs and all. So I can only say that don't give up what you were doing when you were a student. You may not be able to do it every day, but make sure you give 2 to 4 hours a week. That is also enough. But those 2 to 4 hours you must give. I don't know whether I've answered satisfactorily. I mean, it cannot be an everyday demand. I understand that. Life is very, very difficult and tough for young people. But I think 4 hours a week is not that tough if we want to do it. What was that question about parliament?
Can you repeat your question?
No, what was it? It was parliamentary democracy. Opposition parties, I got it. Sir, opposition, jaise we get the politics we deserve, whether it's the ruling party or the opposition. I don't think they are different from us either ruling party or us. I'm beyond the stage of kind of blaming. If you want the opposition, whoever it is, and I don't know which one you're talking about, then we need to push them to do it as citizens. Automatically, it's not going to happen. And whether it is the ruling party which we disagree with or agree with, or the opposition which we disagree with or agree with, we are also part of that political process. So we have to ask that question of ourselves.